Every act of service has a story. Every story has the power to inspire. In a world that is always rushing forward, we pause to listen, to learn, and to lead with purpose. Here, conversations go beyond words. They ignite compassion, leadership, and change. This is TrueRotarian, where service meets storytelling. I am Hemant Bhasin. Thank you for being part of this journey. Let's begin. Today's conversation is deeply moving, historically important, and personally very inspiring. My guest today is Mr. Gautam Hazarika, a former banker turned into historian and a researcher who has dedicated himself into uncovering one of the most forgotten chapters of World War II, the story of Indian prisoners of war in Southeast Asia. His book, The Forgotten Indian Prisoners of World War II, has been widely acclaimed and has brought forgotten human stories into the limelight. Gautam, it's indeed a pleasure to have you on a TrueRotarian podcast.
Thank you, sir. It's my privilege, Hemanji, to be here. And it's very kind of you to think that I'm worthy of being on your platform.
Ladies and gentlemen, I must tell you, 2-3 days ago, we bumped into each other in a bar and we started talking, and I asked him, what do you do? And he told me the story of the book that he's written. And we kept on talking for a little while, and I found this particular story so fascinating. I thought it will be a great thing to bring his story to all my audience about things that we as Indians didn't even know about that. Gautam, thank you once again for coming to TrueRotarian Podcast.
Yes, sir.
Now, you have spent many years as a banker in Singapore. What was that one moment in July 2022 that completely changed the direction of your life?
Hemanji, I have been a history buff all my life, but I've never really researched anything. I collect old books, manuscripts, maps, paintings. My children say that we live in a bookshop. So in July 2022, one day I came across this manuscript that was being sold at an auction in the UK. And it was a very obscure manuscript, a very obscure document about World War II in Singapore. And I bought it, and I'm going to be eventually donating it to the National Library in Singapore because it is about the heritage of Singapore. I thought I knew a lot of things. I thought I was very well read, and I knew a lot of history, but I realized how little I knew. And that sparked my curiosity in researching Singapore in World War II. I was looking for something connecting India and Singapore, my two homes. I've lived half my life in each country. And when I started delving into Singapore in the war, then I met an Indian historian based in Singapore, Jaya. And he told me one day, he just mentioned one sentence, that the Japanese had sent thousands of Indian soldiers to labor in, as he called it, islands in the Pacific. These were the soldiers who had been defending Singapore in World War II. And I hadn't known about this aspect that they had been sent off to hard labor camps. So I started researching, sort of from that book, this whole journey began. And here I am today with you.
Wow. When you came across first about this Changi prison manuscript from 1942, what disturbed you or moved you the most?
So actually it was more moving than disturbing. What was moving was so this manuscript was about the life of 3,000 men who were in Changi prison. These men were the bureaucrats and the civil servants and the businessmen, the European civilians, the British and European civilians who used to live in Singapore and Malaysia before the war began. And some of them had, their wives and children had not left, so there were 500 women and children also, who were in the next block, but they were segregated, they were never allowed to meet. So what moved me most was how these men were, and the women in the block adjacent to them, were able to adjust from being lords of the manor to being in prison in just one day. how they were able to adjust to that new life, how they were able to survive in that life, how they were able to find little joys in cricket, in plays, in poetry, in teaching each other whatever skills they had, and how they secretly contrived to meet their wives and children whenever they got a chance. So that is what moved me about this, about the life in captivity of these men and women. And similarly, to the story of the book that I guess we'll get to in a bit.
You mentioned civilian internees,
Ji.
a term many of us had never even reflected on. Why do you think their stories disappeared from public memory?
You're right about the term civilian internees. That is what intrigued me about this book. And I knew what a summer intern was, but I didn't know what an internee was. I discovered that that was the term given to the civilians who were also kept in prison by the Japanese. The story of the army prisoners of war is more well known, but that there were also civilians who were interned is something that people know less about, and they write less about it. It's an interesting point that you asked. Why is their story forgotten? Firstly, they were smaller in number. There were far more soldiers than there were civilians. Secondly, in a Bible, I would call it, by Dr. Bernice Archer, who researched this topic, she delved into why are these civilian internees not written about, and she said that the defeat of the British Empire by Japan in 1941-42 was such a big shock. Talking about it was painful. Even talking about the soldiers surrendering was painful. If they went into talking about the women and the children also being jailed, it would become even more stark and more of a shame for the British Empire. So she said that that's possibly one of the reasons people just said, let's not talk about this. It's too hard.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
that's the reason that she gave, and she's possibly right. She's researched this a lot more than I have.
Wow. Most Indians know about Subhash Chandra Bose and the INA, but very few people know about Indian prisoners of war sent to Pacific Islands. Why has this chapter remained so obscure?
Imanji, the war ended in 1945, as you know, and we became independent 2 years later. And India focused on its independent history, and did not spend time on what the soldiers did or endured in the colonial era. And I can understand why one focuses on our own history, and that history is not considered our history by some, perhaps. This is also very common in other colonies, former colonies like India. However, I feel that the reason we should know about these men, yes, they may have been fighting in the British era, but what they did was very brave. And their bravery saved Indian lives. So that's why I think it's important for us to know them, to know their story, and to resurrect them, to commemorate them, to respect them.
True.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, you uncovered evidence of Indian soldiers experiencing their own version of hellship, death marches, forced labor camps. How brutal was this reality?
So it was very difficult actually reading the archives that describe this, because the experience was just horrific. We've all seen movies of unfortunate Jewish families being sent in trains to
Yes.
the death camps. This was a similar experience in terms of how they were crowded in. They couldn't sit. They had so little space. There were 2,000 men sharing 2 latrines. Can you imagine?
Oh my God.
Yeah, they were given a bowl of rice, which was often maggot infested, every day in the journey to Papua New Guinea, and 1 bowl of water. They were not allowed to come to the surface of the ship, and they were kept in the cargo holds inside.
Oh my God.
And dozens of them died on the way, and hundreds died later on when they finally reached, because of the sickness that they experienced in the ship. So first was this horrific ship journey. After they reached Papua New Guinea, the horrors continued. Basically, the Japanese needed human beings. They needed people to fortify the territories that they had conquered. They needed people to make airfields. They needed people to make bunkers, etc., etc. And this is what they were using the Indian prisoners in Papua New Guinea for. Just like they used the British and Australian prisoners in the more well-known Bridge on the River Kwai movie, which is about the Thai-Burma Railway. So we experienced, Indian soldiers experienced their equivalent of the Bridge on the River Kwai, but in Papua New Guinea instead. So the conditions were very harsh. There was very little food. There were very little medicines. The Allies had also blockaded this area because they wanted to stop any further Japanese incursion into their territory. So there were no supplies coming. So they had to survive with whatever was available there. They were bombed every day by American bombers. And in fact, in some cases, they used to refer in the archives to enemy planes, even though they were fellow Allied American bombers. But to them, they were being killed by these planes. So, they looked at them as fearful, harmful things. And when the planes came, it's very poignant to read what they say. When the planes are coming to bomb them, there are two types of emotions they feel. One is, oh my God, am I going to survive this?
Right.
The second emotion is, oh, the Allies are not far away. Maybe we are going to be rescued soon.
Oh.
They have to manage and live with these
Mixed
emotions.
Yes.
So it was a very, very sad and poignant story, and it became worse and worse as the war went on. Most of them arrived in the middle of 1943. And by the end of 1944, which is 18 months later, they were at the end of their tether. One of them said that if the war doesn't end in 1945, we are just going to starve to death. We are not going to survive. Fortunately, the war ended, and unfortunately, only a few of them survived. So of the 14,000 who eventually reached Papua New Guinea, only 7,000 were, liberated when the war ended. The other 7,000 died there.
Very sad.
Yeah.
One of the statistics is very chilling. Out of nearly 17,000 Indian POWs sent to hard labor, over 10,000 never returned. Why has this sacrifice not found its place in mainstream Indian history?
I think it's linked to what you asked earlier about so these 17,000 men were a part of the 60,000 prisoners in Singapore. And they were part of the 2.5 million Indian men who joined the Indian Army during the Second World War, the largest volunteer army in history. And their history has been sort of not been looked at and not considered part of our history because it was in the British time. I think it's part of that forgetting what happened in World War II or not focusing on it as much as I think we should. Because even in this case with the Papua New Guinea, the stories that one sees of men defending the other Indian soldiers with them. Some of them, there are at least two cases, documented cases of Indian captains being beheaded by the Japanese because they were interfering with the Japanese ill treatment of the Indian soldiers.
Oh, okay.
So to get them out of the way, they were beheaded. So, but what these two men did, and there were others also, but what these two men did shows how they were willing to lay down their life to save the life of the officers, the men along with them. And there could be nothing braver than that.
While you were researching, and did you ever feel emotionally overwhelmed by what you were reading?
When reading it, I have to say that when reading it, it was sometimes I need to stop because I would sit back and think, did it really happen like this? Could it really have been like this? Could it really have been so bad? What exactly were the men experiencing? What were they thinking of at that time? So it is very chilling when one reads these.
Yes.
When one reads this, and yes, it was quite overwhelming several times to uncover this evidence and to see what the men experienced and how some of the brave men fought back for them.
Your book starts in 1942 Singapore with Captain Mohan Singh, the first commander of the INA. Why is his role so important yet not recognized or under-recognized?
So, Captain Mohan Singh was, as you said, the first commander of the Indian National Army. And his role is very important because he was the man who created and who recruited the men and created the Indian National Army in 1942. And there were other people, very important people, like Rash Bihari Bose, Gyani Pritam Singh, and Major Fujiwara of the Japanese, who were very important in the movement leading up to the creation of the INA. And their role is very critical. However, the job of recruiting the soldiers and of creating the army was done by Mohan Singh. And because the other three people were not in the scene largely at that time. He was, I've really come to admire him because he was a very young man, 32 years old, from a middle class background. And he had joined the army as a Sipahi, a private, at the age of 18.
Okay.
Yeah. And he was recognized as having great potential as an army man. And he was chosen by his British officers to be sent to the first course of the IMA, the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun, starting in 1932. Before that, all the officers were trained at Sandhurst. Okay. From 1932, all the officers were trained in Dehradun.
Yeah.
So he was in the first batch, which included stalwarts like Field Marshal Manekshaw and President Ayub Khan of Pakistan. And most of the most of the cadets in that training program were joining the army for the first time. They were training as officers. But there were just a handful of rankers, that means people who started as a Sipahi, who were chosen to be sent to be trained as officers, and Mohan Singh was one of them. So he was a very slight person. He was 5'7". He was not very large, but he had a great voice. His oratory was very resounding, and people talked about his piercing eyes. And when he spoke, he really spoke with the conviction of what he was feeling. People could make out that yes, he really believed what he is telling us. So he was able to recruit the INA. This was a very difficult thing. It was not easy for the soldiers to suddenly leave the Indian army that they had been part of. Many of them had just joined, but most of them came from families who had had a long military tradition. For them to leave the Indian army and join the Indian National Army was a big step. What exactly did this mean? Joining the Indian National Army meant actually ending up fighting your own brothers in the Indian army.
Yes.
But they were willing to do that because they felt it was for the cause of independence. But nonetheless, it was still a very big step for each man, each soldier. And it has been described by two Indian officers who were there very well. One of them called it a great attraction because he said that they were really enthused by this feeling of fighting for my country. Another one described it as an impossible dilemma. Both great terms, I think, that describe the situation to the soldier. Impossible dilemma, Q. Why? Because it was a dilemma, because you were breaking an oath. Even if your oath was to a foreign king, you were breaking a soldier's code by breaking your oath.
Yes.
Right? It's like breaking your marriage vows in a way.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
So that was what was the dilemma, and it was impossible because the choice before them was either you join the Indian National Army or you get sent to hell in Papua New Guinea. It was a very difficult time for these soldiers, and I have come to realize how difficult it was by looking at the words of these soldiers that survive in the archives today. So Mohan Singh ji, Captain Mohan Singh, who became General Mohan Singh, commanding the Indian National Army, his role was very important. Later on in 1942, he lost faith in the Japanese. He felt that they were not living up to their promises, and he refused to cooperate with them, so he was arrested in December 1942. And it was then that the Japanese asked Hitler to send Netaji. At that time, he was still called Subhash Chandra Bose, who was unfortunately languishing in Berlin because he'd gone to ask Hitler for help to do the same thing, which was to free India. But that didn't work out. And it was then that the Germans sent Subhash Chandra Bose to Asia.
Okay.
And he arrived eventually after a very dangerous submarine journey. He arrived in Singapore in July 1943. And that is the more well-known part of the INA history that most of us are aware of.
Yes.
But the 18 months before that, which was what Mohan Singh had created and done, without Mohan Singh, there would have been no Netaji. He would have just remained Subhash Chandra Bose in Berlin. And Of course, when Netaji arrived, he took the movement to another level.
Another level.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, he was, of course, a great leader. But we must not forget that he had some help. And without Mohan Singh creating the INA, Netaji would not have been called and to fulfill the destiny that he did fulfill.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, now my next question to you is, you describe the INA not as a simple heroic narrative, but as a series of impossible dilemmas. How can you explain this complexity?
Hemanji, the thing is that for the soldier who was in the Indian Army, for him to join the INA, it meant two or three very important things. Yes, he was fighting for his country, but the dilemma part was that he was breaking an oath, which was breaking a soldier's code, and secondly, he would be fighting his own brother in the Indian Army. After all, who was defending India? Yes, there were some British troops there, but the bulk of the men defending India were Indians.
Indians, yes.
It was their own brother. In fact, there were many cases of real brothers on either side in Burma facing off. And
Wow.
fortunately, they actually didn't eventually end up fighting each other, but they could have been. They were on the opposite sides. And the third dilemma was, what would the Japanese do when they reached India? Would they just leave after helping to capture India? That was a big worry many of them had. And so these were the difficult choices, the dilemmas that the men had to take. Another dilemma which I discovered was that the Japanese had very few supplies, even for their own men. So for the Indian INA, they had even less. So the men had very few, they were barely armed, they had very little food, they had very little medicines. And these young soldiers who were in the INA were willing to bear a lot of this hardship. So when you look at the life of the soldier, he has all these mental dilemmas, he has this physical problem of food, of marching bare feet, or not bare feet, but they started off with one pair of boots marching from Malaysia to Burma.
Yeah.
You can imagine what would have happened to that one pair of boots by the time he reached Burma.
Mhm.
So this was the very problematic life that the soldier had to endure and was willing to endure, which is what is quite remarkable.
Wow. When Subhash Chandra Bose took over the INA, what changed strategically and emotionally for Indian soldiers?
So Netaji was one of the greatest speakers and motivators that we've ever had. If you look at anyone who talks about him said that he was a mesmeric person. Even people who didn't understand what he was saying, because he would speak in English or in Hindustani, as it was called in those days. But most of the Indians in Malaysia and Singapore were from South India. They only understood Tamil. They could not understand what he was saying. But yet, they were crying listening to him talking.
Wow.
Yeah, there were women who would give up their jewelry as a donation for the cause. So he really mesmerized and mesmerized the people and took the movement to another level. He had one other great brainwave. In this one stroke, he doubled the size of the movement. What he did was, so far the women, who obviously are half the people, they were not contributing. They wanted to contribute to the movement, but there was no role for them. The main thing in the movement was you were a soldier or a spy. And the women were only asked to be nurses. When he arrived, he decided to form the Rani Jhansi Regiment, an all-women's regiment, which, as I said, instantly doubled the size of the movement, because you now had the women who also had a role. And so this is an example of the measures that he took that really moved the movement to a different level. He also upgraded the relationship between India and the Indians in the movement and the Japanese, because though Mohan Singh was a great recruiter, Netaji was of a totally different level, and Japanese were more amenable to giving us some of the things that we needed.
Mhm.
So he really made a huge difference with the movement when he came.
Would you say the INA lost the war, but won India's freedom in a psychological sense.
Absolutely, sir. The INA did lose the battle, but they won the war, as you have said.
Mhm.
And how did they win the war? When the war ended, when World War II ended, and the British decided to make an example of some of the INA soldiers. Technically, everyone who joined the INA was guilty of treason, which was punishable by death or life in prison. But of course, they could not court-martial 22,000 men, so they decided to court-martial in the beginning about 600, but eventually only a few dozen were put to trial. And when the war ended, the news blackout about the INA was lifted. And when the people of India got to know about the INA, when they got to know that these young soldiers were willing to endure this hardship to fight to free India, it really took the country by storm. And I have seen this in all the documents. These documents were made by the British themselves, describing how the INA had the complete support of the people of India. Rich, poor, north, south, east, west, educated, uneducated, rural, urban. Everyone was mesmerized by was really found that the INA was a great example to look up to. And more importantly, the Sipahi and the Havildar in the Indian Army, who had been till now fighting the INA, or at least willing to fight them if they had proceeded further into India. Once the war was over, the Indian Army also said, the soldiers also said that, look, we won the war, and let's be good to them, and they were on the side of the INA. So yes, you're right. The INA won the heart of the people of India, and it certainly hastened independence because the British realized that they could not hold India any longer.
Any longer, yes. You know, one of the most powerful aspects of your work is reconnecting families with their ancestors' stories. Which reunion affected you most personally?
So this has been the most gratifying part of this journey, to meet families and tell them what happened, how brave their father or grandfather was. In many cases, the soldier went back home. In some cases, he died, so they didn't know what happened to him. In many cases, he went back home and never talked about it because it's very difficult to talk to other people who have not experienced this.
Yes.
What happened? Because how do you explain to someone that we are fighting in a battle and the person sitting next to you has his brains blown out and his brains are splattered all over your face? Even thinking about that would give you shivers. How do you talk about this with your children? And how do you talk about eating lizards and eating leaves to survive? It's unimaginable.
Yes.
So it's very difficult to relate to this. So that's why they didn't really talk about it. So I have found extremely brave soldier stories in the archives, and it's been my great privilege to be able to tell those family members about this.
I can understand what you must be going through. You often speak about waiting wives, women who waited 5 years with little or no news. Why do you believe their suffering deserved equal recognition?
So this is something that I must say that I did not focus on enough.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it all began once when I was speaking to the son of a soldier, and after talking to him for some time, he says, "Gautam, you have asked me so many questions about my father. You've not asked me about my mother." I asked him, "What happened to your mother?" And then he explained to me what happened to his mother. He explained to me that his mother had been waiting for 5 years with no news of her husband. She didn't know whether he was dead or alive. She was very young herself, and she had very young children to look after. And she had to bear this all alone, look after the children, wake up every morning with a smiling face to them,
Yes.
so that they don't, realize actually what is going on behind in the background. And that was something that I found equally brave in my mind. And I realize now that a soldier's story, what happened to him is only half the story. The other half of the story is what happened to his family
Family,
while
that's
he
right.
was away.
That's right.
So,
That's right. Your idea of commemorating the waiting wife at India's National War Memorial is deeply moving. What response have you received so far about this?
So, to be honest, it's just an ambition. I am, just beginning to look into this, but it is something that I think I would really like to do in some way. Maybe there, to be honest, maybe there is a commemoration already somewhere about the waiting wife. There's a very vibrant Army Wives Association. I have to reach out to them and tell them about the stories that I know, get their help to see how we can reach out and find more families and work with them to try to do to make sure that we commemorate the waiting wife in the best way possible that they deserve.
If you ever need any help in this particular regard, please let me know. My brother-in-law retired as a Vice Chief of Indian Navy,
Okay.
and when he was in service, my sister was also part of that.
The Forces Wives.
Forces Wives Association. I'm sure they'll be able to guide you,
Thank you.
on that. You are now working on another book and also on documentaries on Indian spies in World War II in Southeast Asia. What excites you most about this phase?
So basically, when I was researching the soldiers, I found the stories of these civilian spies. One can expect a soldier to have an adventurous life, but these civilian spies were, they were not from Oxford, Cambridge. They didn't have any fancy background. They were simple, humble men. They were school teachers. They were Darans. They were, printing press operators, and they were very, very enthused by the independence movement. Some of them had come from India to work in Malaysia, and some of them were second, third generation Indians living in Malaysia. They had never even set foot in India. Malaysia was their home, but India was their homeland.
Okay.
Is the way they thought of it. And these men wanted to do something, and they first said we will fight. Then they were told that look, we have Mohan Singh has recruited enough soldiers. We have enough soldiers. We need spies. That job is possibly even more dangerous because you will be sent. What was their job? They had to go to India to create Gadar, to create chaos in India, to incite the people to rise up against the British. And they knew that if they were caught, they would be hanged. In fact, many of them were. So this was a very brave mission that they undertook. Again, they went through the same dilemmas that the soldier went through about, can we trust the Japanese? But they said, okay, I will do my mission and I'll leave the politics to the Bade Saabs. So they, as, soldier spies went, they were taught, all the spycraft like surveillance, how to, get information without getting caught, how to make bombs, how to communicate with each other, what sort of signals they would use. They were taught that when you have a rendezvous with your fellow spy, what should you do? You must because this fellow spy might have been caught and might have been turned by the administration in India. So you've got to figure out, whether he's still on your side or not. How to, work in this behind the scenes way is what they were taught to do. Many of them were brought by Japanese submarines to the coast of India. Some were brought to the east coast, some were brought to the west coast. Dramatic stories of, the submarine. First night it was too stormy, they couldn't get off the submarine. The next night they had to do it. They got into a rubber dinghy, it capsized. And we've seen lots of movies about World War II in Europe where you have British commandos going on to the Nazi-occupied Europe. But we have stories of our own men doing exactly the same thing. And it's described in great detail how they would bury all the evidence, how they would bury in certain places the important equipment that they would need to come back for, like radios and things like that. They had weapons, they had money to sustain their life there. And I found the story very exciting. The spy part, it was very chilling to learn about when they were caught, how they were tried in secret courts that were held, that were not publicized, and how 13 of them were hanged. And it was very sad because many of the others who were caught were given life sentences. This happened in 1944, 1943, and 2 years later, all those people with life sentences were freed by the British themselves. because now the crime had not changed, but the politics had changed.
Yes.
So just 18 months later, all their fellow men who had fortunately not been hanged were now free men.
Now free men.
So that's what really drove me to this, attracted me to this story.
Wow. If someone is listening today, suspects their grandfather or a great grandfather may have been part of this particular forgotten stories, what should they be doing to know more about this?
So actually, it's a very good question, and in fact, it's the main mission that I have right now. I mean, maybe mission is a very glorified word, but in a small way, whatever I can do in helping anyone reconnect with their family, they can reach out to me. They can try to gather, firstly, whatever memories, family memories they have. Most people will say, "Mere ko kuch nahi pata. I don't know anything.
Mhm.
I never met him." But if you sit down and think, you will always find some memory told to you by some other relative about what might have happened to their father, grandfather, great grandfather. They could have some letters or documents, but those may not exist. But the memories are equally very important, and those are in fact more important. And if they just sit down and try to think about it, I'm sure they'll be able to find some memories. And those memories need to be recorded. And I'd be very happy and very honored to do it.
Excellent, excellent. Gautam, after everything that you have discovered, researched, and shared, what does freedom mean to you today?
Oh, so freedom to me means the freedom of being able to think and do, what one believes in, and also, I don't think of freedom in this large, broad way. For me, freedom would be that if someone is allowed to think about their family, what I'm trying to achieve is if even one person listening to this podcast goes back and tries to find out about his or her grandfather, I think your and my job is done.
Excellent.
That is freedom to me.
Well, Gautam, thank you so much for reminding us that history is not just about dates and battles. It's about people. It's about families, courage, and sacrifice. Your work ensures that these forgotten Indian soldiers are forgotten no more. I'm sure someone, after he or she sees this particular podcast, may get tempted to also make a documentary or a movie. As you mentioned, in the West, we have movies like that, and the kind of things that people have forgotten or not talked about Indian POWs. I'm sure somebody who loves history, who loves to make these kind of movies, they're going to get tempted and going to get in touch with you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm also going to share Gautam's biodata in the description box. If you have any questions about the subject that we have discussed, you are free to get in touch with him. And if you also have a story to tell or a project to discuss, please do get in touch with us. It will be my honor to call you on the show. Thank you so much. This is Hemant Bhasin signing off from London. Thank you and Jai Hind. Thank you, Gautam.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Honor to be here. Yes.